In 2023, I went through one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It all started when I had to rent a cabin temporarily. At the time, my dad and I weren't getting along, and I needed a place to stay on my own. The cabin was part of a sublet agreement since the previous tenant had personal issues and abandoned the property. The landlord, who I'll just call the owner for simplicity, offered it on a month-to-month rental basis, which was perfect for my situation. The cabin was unusual. It was a small, two-story building. The ground floor had a compact kitchen, a decent-sized living room, and upstairs there was a bedroom accessed by a small flight of stairs. But the strange thing was that the bedroom could only be reached through a hatch-like door in the floor. Despite that, I settled in pretty well. The cabin was located at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by a few other similar-sized houses. Most of them seemed occupied, but I never met the neighbors. My routine was simple. I worked long 12-hour shifts, and when I got home, I just wanted to eat something quick, watch TV, and go to bed. I always closed the hatch door to the bedroom before sleeping. Something about leaving it open at night made me feel vulnerable. Everything changed on what seemed like an ordinary night. I came home tired and made myself a quick snack before heading upstairs to the bedroom. I was watching TV in bed when, out of nowhere, I heard a voice. It came from downstairs and said, "Who's up there?" My body froze. It sounded like the voice came from inside the cabin, but it could have been from outside too. I immediately turned off the TV and crawled to the circular window above the bed to try to see something. The darkness outside was impenetrable. My voice shaking, I called out, "Who's there?" But the only response I got was deafening silence, the kind that almost hurts your ears. After a few minutes, I gathered the courage to open the hatch door. I peeked through the opening and called out, even saying my dad's name, thinking maybe he had come by as a surprise. Nothing. I decided to go downstairs, my heart pounding. I turned on the living room light, and there was no one there. I looked out the windows, turned on the exterior lights, but again nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. I went back upstairs, closed the hatch, and tried to distract myself by watching TV. But not even 5 minutes later, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Knocking on the bedroom door below. The knocks were loud, almost as if the person wanted to scare me. This time, there was no doubt. Someone was inside the cabin. Fear paralyzed me. I knew the hatch didn't have a lock, meaning the intruder could easily come upstairs. I stayed completely still, not making a sound, hoping whoever it was would leave. After about 20 minutes of silence, I worked up the courage to move. I looked for my phone, but it wasn't in the bedroom. Maybe I had left it downstairs. Opening the hatch door slowly, I looked into the dimly lit living room, where the flickering light from the TV was the only illumination. I couldn't see anyone, but I crept down the stairs as quietly as I could. Instead of turning on any lights, I ran barefoot out the back door and headed to the nearest house, where I knew people lived. When I got there, I banged on the door frantically. Soon, I saw someone staring at me through a window next to the door. I quickly explained what had happened, saying I was their neighbor and needed a phone to call the police. But the person just stood there, staring at me, saying nothing. It was deeply unsettling. At that moment, I started backing away. What if that person had something to do with what was happening? I returned to the cabin, still terrified. The back door was just as I had left it, and I went back inside, locking it behind me. I turned on all the lights, trying to make myself feel safer. I searched for any signs of someone in the house, and for my phone. Finally, I remembered it was in my car. I had left it in the center console earlier when I got home. When I returned to the bedroom, something happened that I will never forget. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw a man sitting on my bed, staring at the TV. He didn't say anything. When he noticed me, he slowly turned his head to look at me. I didn't wait to see anything else. I ran back down the stairs and out of the cabin, calling 911 as I locked myself in my car. I sat in the car, watching the cabin from a distance while speaking to the operator. That's when I saw a figure pass through the yard and disappear into the woods. I told the dispatcher what I saw. Shortly after, a police car arrived. The officers searched the cabin and the upstairs bedroom, but found no one. I told him about the person running into the woods, and he asked if I had anywhere else to stay that night. Swallowing my pride, I returned to my dad's house with some of my essential belongings. The next day, I went back to the cabin to collect the rest of my things. The landlord agreed to refund part of my rent, but his reaction was strange. When I asked if anything like this had happened before, he avoided the question, as if he was hiding something. To this day, I think about that night and try to make sense of it. The bizarre behavior of the neighbor, the landlord's suspicious attitude, and the man inside the cabin. Maybe it's all connected. Or maybe, just maybe, it's my mind trying to find answers to something unexplainable. It was a Tuesday night, around 11 p.m., back in 2013. I was walking home after work, as my car was in the shop, and I had no choice but to walk about 3 miles every day. The walk usually took me about an hour, so I would get home just before midnight. I lived in a small town in southern Indiana. After 10 p.m., it was rare to see any cars on the road. The only vehicles passing by were usually trucks heading to Indianapolis. That night, I was about a mile from home when I turned onto a dirt road. My house was in a secluded area, surrounded by forest, so I had to take these back roads to get there. As I was walking, I heard the sound of an engine in the distance. It was getting closer. I turned to look and saw a van far behind me, moving slowly with its headlights off. At first, I didn't think much of it. In my town, it wasn't uncommon to see old vehicles with broken headlights. I continued walking, but I started to pick up my pace as I noticed the van creeping closer. Suddenly, I heard the roar of the van's engine as it sped up. This time, its headlights were on, lighting up the road. My heart began to race. When the van approached the turn onto the dirt road, it turned its headlights off again and slowed down. That's when fear really set in. This wasn't a coincidence. I kept walking, trying not to look scared. I glanced back several times, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. And then I saw something that froze me to the core. The van had stopped, and both the driver's and passenger's doors were open. That was all I needed to see. I broke into a run. As I sprinted down the dirt road, I heard what I can only assume was a gunshot. My adrenaline spiked, and I ran faster, thinking this might be the end. I veered off the road into the forest, hiding behind a large rock. I crouched there, trying to steady my breathing and make no noise. Then I heard voices. A man's voice called out. I think she ran into the woods. To my horror, I heard what sounded like young girls responding. One of them said, "Okay, sir, we'll see if we can find her." My fear reached a new level. I wasn't just worried for my life anymore. I was terrified of what this sick group of people might do to me. I clamped my hand over my mouth to avoid making any sound. Then I heard the man say something that chilled me to my core. Whoever finds her first doesn't have to drink the blood tonight. A million thoughts raced through my mind. Was this some kind of satanic cult? Were those girls kidnapped? Was I going to become one of them? I stayed completely still behind a rock, praying they wouldn't find me. What felt like an eternity passed before I heard sirens in the distance. Red and blue lights began to flash through the forest. Relief washed over me as I saw the lights getting closer. I bolted out from behind the rock, screaming for help. The police saw me and ran to my aid. One of the officers asked, "Ma'am, are you aware of the body?" Confused, I asked, "What body?" That's when I saw it, right in front of their patrol car, the most horrifying sight I'd ever seen. It was the body of a young woman, naked and mutilated, with blood everywhere. There was no sign of the van or the people in it. I explained everything to the police, the van, the man, and the girls. They said they would investigate and kindly offered to drive me home. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I glanced out my window and saw the same van driving slowly down my street, once again with its headlights off. This time, I was prepared. I quickly wrote down the license plate number and called the police immediately. When the officers arrived, the van was already gone, but what they told me still haunts me to this day. The license plate I had written down was registered in South Dakota. However, that same night, reports of a suspicious van with the exact same plate number had been made in Vermont, Nevada, Alaska, and Texas. The officers said they would contact me if they found anything, but I never got a call. To this day, I don't know what really happened. I don't believe in the paranormal, but my best guess is that it was some sort of cult using fake license plates to carry out their sick activities across the country. After that night, I moved out of Indiana. Now, whenever I see something suspicious, I don't hesitate, I run. I need to tell you about something that happened to Elisa, a co-worker of mine. This happened about 5 years ago, and to this day, she avoids talking about it. But I remember every detail she told me, and just thinking about it sends chills down my spine. Elisa was a teacher at a small school here in town. She was a super calm person, you know? The kind of person you'd never imagine something bad could happen to. One autumn night, after a meeting that ended late, she decided to take a shortcut through a park trail that runs through the forest near her neighborhood. I had already heard that the park was a little creepy, but to be fair, it was the fastest route to her house. According to Elisa, the night was eerily quiet. No sound of crickets, no wind, nothing. Just the crunch of dry leaves under her feet. At first, everything seemed normal. The path was familiar, and she just wanted to get home quickly. But as she walked, she realized the trail felt longer than usual. She knew the route well, and how long it should take to cross. But that night, it was as if the path wouldn't end. That's when she started hearing footsteps. At first, they were faint, as if someone was walking behind her, keeping a distance. She stopped and looked back, but there was nothing. She tried to ignore it and kept walking, but the footsteps grew louder and closer. At this point, she was gripping her phone tightly, but the flashlight didn't help much because the darkness felt dense. She yelled, "Who's there?" but no one answered. And then she started walking faster, almost running. The footsteps didn't stop. On the contrary, whoever, or whatever, it was started running after her too. When Elisa finally saw a clearing ahead, she felt relieved. But the moment she reached it, something appeared in her path. It was a figure, but not human. She described it as tall, thin, and deformed, with arms so long they almost touched the ground. Its eyes glowed a yellow color that, according to her, was impossible to forget. The thing pointed at her and, in a whisper that seemed to come from all directions, said just one word, "Behind." Elisa turned to look, but she didn't see anything. When she turned back to the front, the figure was gone. That was the moment she truly panicked. She started running through the forest, not knowing where she was going. She said it felt like the trees were closing in, blocking every exit. And then something grabbed her leg. She fell to the ground and saw a hand coming out of the earth. A pale, thin hand that gripped her ankle tightly. Elisa kicked and managed to free herself. But when she looked around, she realized the ground was full of these hands, all reaching out toward her. She ran with everything she had and finally saw the street. As soon as she reached the sidewalk, she dropped to her knees, exhausted. The silence returned, and she thought it was all over. But then she saw something that froze her blood. Right in front of her, on the ground, was a dry leaf. But it wasn't an ordinary leaf. It was stained with something red, like dried blood, and written on it was the same word the figure had said, "Behind." After that night, Elisa never went near that park again. In fact, she even moved to a different neighborhood. Whenever someone asks about it, she just gives a nervous smile and changes the subject. But the way she told me this story, how her voice trembled, I know everything she said was real.